A warm welcome from my side. You are all practitioners and well-versed in the issues. So in the opening comments from my side, to set the stage for the rest of the day, I thought I would take some broad issues that cut across the specific interests and concerns that you have, and they should connect with the sessions that follow. If we had done this event 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I think we would start very much with the story of productivity, raising the productivity and matching the demand for both the consumers and the producers to have greater welfare. And Asia has had enormous success, broadly speaking, with a lot of differences across regions. But we are starting this discussion today, and I can't help but put up a slide first that would make us sit up, that things have changed. A very successful region, the greatest growth rate seen historically, and also we'll see in a few minutes on agriculture productivity. Certainly East Asia stands out as the best performer worldwide in the developing world. That said, I think a phenomenon that is hurting the short-term as well as long-term growth patterns in agriculture and broadly, that has to be taken on board seriously with urgency, and that affects the various sessions that you will be participating in later today. In this picture, highly selective, it just encapsulates three stories, but over the last 40 years, floods and storms have increased fourfold in the region, not earthquakes and volcanoes. Why is that? We may have to discuss this later, but the phenomenon of greater floods and storms affecting food and agriculture and now economic growth of countries is a reality. So the numbers are large, but they may not necessarily catch the attention of the finance ministers, because if a country's growth rate is 6%, you're not going to say that the growth rate is going to be 4% because of natural disasters. But in agriculture and food, they are big. In a way, the Pakistan flood stands out because of the vast coverage and the impact on lives and livelihoods in a heavily agricultural area. The Thailand flood is a bigger one in terms of the total damage. Not shown here is the fact that some $46 billion were lost. That would be about 13% of Thailand's GDP, arguably one of the greatest setbacks that you can imagine in recent decades. Then the super typhoon Haiyan is clearly the most devastating in terms of the sheer natural phenomena. Natural or natural cum man-made phenomena, we can discuss that, but it is absolutely staggering in its impact on human beings. On agriculture, here again the figure, the production loss is set at 250 million or thereabouts, is large, but it is smaller than what you have in Pakistan or Thailand. There's a lot to be said about this, but the question is, we need to blend this with the long-term story, which is, in my discussion, I guess it would fall in three parts. The first part is about agricultural productivity, what goes into that and what can be done to enhance. The second part, not captured in the first slide, is the story that along with the agricultural and growth story is also growing inequalities in the region. And the fact that Asia in particular has some 350 million small farmers, or less than 2 hectares, and that is both a source of joy and source of concern that their well-being and their participation is critical, but if they did, that's a huge potential for upgrading the performance of the region. So that is the second part, the inclusion, how that comes in. And then the third, quite a lot of the sessions will focus on hunger and malnutrition in particular. It's not enough to just do the growth and inclusion, but special efforts are needed. Times are tough. Special interventions are quite justified on economic grounds. There was a time when those had a negative connotation, but that is what it takes to get the most out of it. And so together with the long-term growth and inclusion, what are the special efforts needed on food such that hunger and malnutrition can be reduced in real time, and the numbers are big in Asia. So let me run through these slides fairly quickly, just so that we have at least 10 minutes for a discussion or commentary rather than question and answer commentary from you, the experts. First of all, when we talk about productivity, of course, there are many definitions. Some people talk about productivity of land. Some people talk about total productivity of all the factors, not just land, people, and technology all combined. But just to simplify all that and put it against a storyline of what could be the yield under the real conditions, not totally fictitious conditions, and what is the yield, and then see what the gap is. And this is more useful for comparisons than to say that we are absolutely sure that this gap is a real gap. I don't think anyone can claim that, because the conditions may not apply exactly as you thought in the laboratory setup and so on. But what is extraordinary is that the gap using similar techniques differs. That's bad news and good news. I mean, you have a large gap, then you can catch up. And so being stuck with a gap is positive in terms of actions that can be taken. You would see the striking difference between East Asia and anyway, it's fairly clear. East Asia and South Asia down. Sub-Saharan Africa, for all the reasons that we can discuss, really stands out as with a bigger gap. And in this setup, if you focus a bit more at the country level, then differentiating dry and wet season, you see that in four comparable countries, the differences are not huge, but there are differences, somewhat systematic. Thailand and Vietnam generally having a lower gap than Philippines and Indonesia. In the Philippines, there is quite a discussion of why that should be. Some of the innovations have come from the Philippines. Some of the research has come from the Philippines. Philippines is a leader in developing approaches, and yet why is the gap in productivity smaller in Vietnam or Thailand? We won't have time for country-level discussions today, at least in this session, but I hope we can pursue this, because at the end of the day, that's where the implications are to be drawn. Against that picture of differences across regions, differences across countries, particularly in these areas of major staples, we see a declining productivity growth picture over the past some decades. And is that surprising? I mean, productivity seems to go up in many areas, not just in IT and more high-tech areas, but many aspects of manufacturing, services. But why declining in the most basic and most critical area of agriculture? So this deserves some discussion. There have been several reports from the multilateral development banks showing declining investments in agriculture, perhaps a sense of complacency that it's the next stage of development that you have to quickly go through, and de-emphasizing agriculture and emphasizing industry is somehow a mark of progress. Research running out of steam on several aspects, its applications across regions. So there is a whole discussion of why agriculture productivity should be going down and not going up. Now, to take some aspects of that, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a total factor productivity, and then there is just land, and how much does one produce per hectare of land. That's sometimes easier to conceptualize than whatever the total factor productivity would be. So in that case, if you take a piece of land in one country versus another, and if you see differences in productivity of the same crop, the availability of the same technology in principle being there, that would make us sit up and figure out why that should differ. And so even within the same country, these are very different, for example, in India. So here, a question, how do these three factors affect productivity of land? These are actual phenomena taking place, large and fast-growing population. If there are more people on land, does that raise or increase productivity of land? Well, in a way, it should increase, provided the additional numbers are also educated in the relevant sense for the job at hand. So that is one. Now, rapid urbanization, people leaving the farm, could also work the other way, in the sense there are fewer people, and especially if that is also taking away embodied human capital, then that would be a downer for agriculture productivity. And then the third one, which is somewhat related to the very first slide, things are changing, pressures are greater, land is fixed in a physical sense. You can improve the quality. All other factors of production are more mobile, more flexible in its size, and so the increasing competition that could be seen to reduce productivity. What is not mentioned here are government interventions, policy framework, just the sheer amount of money that goes into agriculture. All of those affect the productivity of land. Taken together, we have the previous picture. Although that may be on the total factor productivity, the same thing may be applicable on the land productivity, and it's been going down. So they give you some levers for where to act. On top of that is more squarely the first graph, first picture, first slide coming back, that climate impact on agriculture productivity is real. You could look at the various recent research done on it and make a judgment whether, in some zones this is a plus and some zones this is a minus. Taken together, I have no doubt that it's negative. I would like to have some discussion of that, that taken together, climate impact on agriculture productivity is negative. And now, number two, drought and flood-resistant crop varieties and farming technologies. The need to develop them and the payoffs to having them is just all-time high, and it is probably going to get higher as we go along. And then farmers' adaptation techniques, a very nascent field, very little really done, including by international organizations who are trying to get into this and do things as part of projects, but I would say that it is really early stages, and this potentially can go the distance as well. So just in the interest of time, those slides in a very encapsulated form tell us a story about a declining productivity long-term picture, added to that new pressures, sociological, socioeconomic, and climate, against which the urgency for raising productivity is very high, with some mixed stories on what productivity increase would do, but bottom line is that this is an urgent agenda right now. Is it just the old style question of just let's raise productivity however you can, or do you have to have some filter that puts an emphasis on inclusive increase in productivity? Now, it's making the agenda more complicated. It's hard enough to talk about productivity increase, but should it also be inclusive? And what is inclusive? Everyone doing as well as everybody else? What is the story? I mean, here, let's first look at why this is sort of important. Without getting to all the nuts and bolts of this, simply put, it just graphs on the right side the income, per capita income of various countries. So you see some countries mentioned here: Nepal, Indonesia, India, Philippines, China. And then on the left side, how unequal they are. This is not in agriculture, but generally. So, in a given year. So it's in a given year, 2009-10. So what does it say? Well, PRC in this picture is more unequal than Nepal. And of course, the income of PRC is also much greater. If we had done the same picture for a different year, let's say 1970, PRC would look far more to the left, right? I mean, left being much more equal than it is today. For the same income, for the sort of similar income, Philippines is more unequal than Indonesia or India. So that's the storyline. Now, what kind of a graph would this be? Would it be like as you get richer, you become more unequal? As you get richer, you get less unequal? Which way would you imagine the picture to be? So, if you think about it, this is the graph that emerged from fitting it. By the way, in the second one, you can see Thailand also right in the middle between the Philippines and Indonesia. So for that particular year, what we have is a inverted U-shaped curve. Slightly good news in the sense that, well, if you wait long enough, income distribution would get better. But a serious concern that that may not happen fast enough, that things have become tougher to do this, and so engineering a better income distribution is very, very essential for a country's continued success. And so this is the Asia story. If you had the other regions, of course, we'll have a different picture. Just in a nutshell, Asia is not the most unequal region. It was one of the most equal regions 15 years ago. Today, Asia is becoming comparable to Latin America, which used to be the most unequal region. And so things are going the wrong way on equality. So that's the backdrop to worrying about inclusion in agriculture. Now, the question is, we don't have time to go into this, whether worrying about agricultural productivity with inclusion in mind is good for productivity or bad for productivity. And what I would just put on the table as a means for discussion is that with so many small farmers, with the gap that we saw on productivity in various countries, it enhances productivity to aim for steps that are more inclusive than less inclusive. And so the rationale is that this is part of improving productivity, not a trade-off or not something that we should worry about as a cost. In a way, this picture supports that view, okay? For these 4 countries, the green lines show agriculture value added per worker, and the yellow line shows the poverty decline. It's a head count ratio of poverty. So, you know, they cross like a pair of scissors everywhere. So it's good to raise productivity, or it's good to lower poverty. No causality here. We can't say one led to the other, but they go together. What else do you want to know? They go together. So do whatever it takes to make sure that they can go together. Thailand is extraordinary. I was stunned by the poverty numbers. It just leaps off the page. Maybe we can have a discussion whether these are comparable, but it is striking that Philippines does have a high rate of poverty for its income level, and also striking that the rate of decline of the yellow line in Vietnam is so sharp. But that has gone hand in hand with productivity, agriculture value added, etc. Okay. Then very quickly, the reason or the case for worrying about inclusion not only is that economic one that is good for growth, it's also that food security and poverty are big deals in the region. In sheer numbers, this is dramatic, that 66% of the world's hungry are in Asia. Recall it's South and East Asia combined. Food security poses a major risk to inclusive growth. And the vulnerability of the insecure farmers is something to reckon with. So combining these 2 strands, the concept, the idea that we worry about the new threats to sustainability, especially from climate change, but we also worry about inclusive. There is the need to blend the 2, inclusive and sustainable. And I hope we don't see this as an agenda that keeps expanding and makes it harder, rather that two interactive things that makes the impact of what we do better. So if you just looked at the effort side, it'd say, okay, this is A, B, C, and now you say E, F, G. You're just adding up things, and it's too much to worry about. But if you think on the other side of the ledger, for any effort, if you had combined inclusion and sustainability, you get a better impact. I think that's a better way to look at it than the first, that go after the outcomes or impact, not the inputs and the outputs. So if you did that, adoption of rates of modern and sustainable technologies, worrying about sustainability and inclusion, infrastructure capacity to thrive in modern value chains for the small farmers particularly, and then equally worrying about efficiency and emission reductions, extraordinary numbers on that, and then building and crop insurance, particularly in the face of the natural disaster slide that I showed you. So, yes, raise agriculture productivity, the first segment of our discussions, too, but at the same time, blend sustainability with inclusion because they are doable and the payoffs are high. And then turning to the third part, hunger and malnutrition. Once we worry about this in the policy framework and so on, is a special effort need beyond that, or would the market take care of it? I think all evidence shows that we're comparing countries that have grown very fast, very slow. There is that hunger story that goes beyond what can be explained by the sheer fact that countries have grown. Very high growth rates in India in a certain period, also seeing at the same time hunger and malnutrition. We'll come to that in a minute, especially on children, that have huge costs for the future. So a case for special action going beyond productivity that is inclusive and sustainable, targeted, the efforts of the private sector, the public sector. This becomes a real part of the three-part package that I'm presenting today. So on the prevalence of undernourishment, just like in the case of the productivity story, the differences and how much has changed between 2 decades are notable. The change between the 2 decades is going from the yellow to the green. The differences between the regions are the 2 blocks, let's say for South Asia, compared with East Asia in this case, right? So you can see this quite interestingly for the regions, that East Asia and South Asia do look quite different, whereas both have reduced the prevalence of undernourishment. The difference and the decline that's much stronger in East Asia. And then comparing those same 4 countries that we have been staying with in this presentation, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand, you see some dramatic reductions in Thailand and also Vietnam compared to the other 2. The reason for these comparisons really is it's the best motivator for policymakers because you're looking at comparable countries, at least to some extent, and what has been achieved and why the same thing is not possible elsewhere. And then from hunger to malnutrition, this is where I was particularly pointing out to the future growth story, the same pattern or the same type of pictures as the previous one, comparing the regions between 2 decades and then comparing the same for underweight and stunting. We couldn't do the same thing for the countries that we had in the previous picture as easily with comparable data. So the prevalence of underweight in South Asia should worry us. Prevalence of stunting in South Asia should worry us. Both have improved, so what would it take to scale this effort up and to make some of the exceptions the norm so that this is a changed picture in less than a generation? We don't have time to make comparisons with the other regions, but they are very, very interesting. So we have quickly looked at the picture of long-term productivity and then the combination of sustainability and inclusion within that, and then the particular problems of malnutrition and hunger. And then are ready to take them together to see whether there are some buttons to push hard going forward. So on malnutrition and hunger, on specific actions, I think here the small actions, small meaning specific, region specific, even locality specific, age group specific, those actions are extraordinarily important because they are demonstrations and they can be scaled up. But we really, really need excellent models of dissemination and excellent models of just copying or exchanging and just duplicating and then scaling up and then making them marketable. And so you need really the cooperation and the presence of different ministries and different private sector agencies. If it is food and agriculture, it's not enough to have the food minister or the finance or the agriculture minister at the table. It has to be the health as well. It has to be the finance. It has to be the planning. What I mean is that these issues discussed in the other sessions, biofortification of staple crops, good examples, micronutrient supplementation, good examples, safety nets when things really fall to pieces to be brought up. Some good examples, not a lot, but they all need to be scaled up. Otherwise, they are nice boutique examples, and we may feel good about it, but in the big picture, they don't affect the big stories that we mentioned, and so the problems continue. And so how to pull this together, market it in the best sense of the word, and get at the table the interest of not just the particular minister directly involved, but especially the planning and finance group, because this is critical for welfare, but also critical for the growth story, would be the bottom line interest. So as we look through these examples during the day, I hope we can think about the scaling up question. What are some good examples of these scaled up or going to scale in a way that they really begin to affect in a reasonably short time the bottom line that we saw earlier on these two pictures. Okay, so with those three segments, I think we can go to the final slide on actions. This obviously, just for being selective, is very, very limited and it's not comprehensive at all. But if we can take one at a time briefly, investments in agriculture, are the investment levels what they need to be? And not just by the public sector, but the private sector. The public sector investments have come down. And very recently, and just don't have the complete data, but very recently, those have begun to sort of turn the other way from very low levels. And the contribution of multilateral development banks has also followed suit in that sense. Maybe some of that is even stronger than what you see at the country level. But is that anywhere close to where it needs to be, given the nature of the problems? And if it is to be higher, where does that money come from? Would we consider cost recovery? Would we consider dropping some things that are not paying off that much? Would we consider partnerships? Would we consider just much better leveraging and private sector coming in a much bigger way, not to do good only, but because it's such good business? So what does it take to show a stronger reversal in the decline of agricultural investments that we have seen in the last few years? That's the first question, and I hope you may have some comments on that in the next few minutes. The second, the question of more growth coming from lower income strata. So the inclusion in agriculture, we talked about the numbers of 350 million small farmers, less than 2 hectares a day in Asia. And that inclusion of the smaller farmers, is that charity or is that what will make the growth of agriculture better? So investment is one thing, the quality of investment is equally important, but that doesn't assure anything. We saw rising investments in earlier decades without commensurate impact on productivity. So to get that, the quality of investment is extremely critical, but then having greater inclusion in the process would that make the impact of higher investments better or not, is a question. My thinking on this would be a very simple one. If you had the whole world as one country, you have high income, middle income, and low income. And if you said that we're going to rely on the growth of high income countries because they are clearly the bigger part of the pie, you get a certain growth rate of the world thought of as one country. That growth would be very similar to the growth of the high income countries, which is always lower than the middle and the low income countries. High income countries never grow as fast as middle and low income countries. We can discuss why, but if the growth rate of high income countries is 2 or 3%, the middle and the low income would be 5 to 6%. So if you had a country with high income agriculture and low income agriculture, and if the low income agriculture is a large part, it's commonsensical to say that the more the low income participants are part of the growth process, the chance of your country's growth being a little bit higher than otherwise is that much greater. Just like in the world grows faster if you allow middle income and low income countries to participate more, not the other way around. So one intuition is yes, those who have growing is easier, but the better intuition is that if you get the lower incomes to grow faster, then the overall growth would be that much faster. So more growth from lower income strata is a good policy. How to do it sensibly, how to do it without subsidies that are sometimes more harmful than good, how to avoid some of the mistakes of the past of massive subsidies for fertilizers and pesticides, which never really got to the poor anyway. So, and then also having sensible prices and so on. That's a challenge. I mean, this is not a session to go into those, but in the second bullet, I wanted to be clear. It is about including the lower income in good ways, in economically efficient ways, not to have crazy policies that actually would do more harm than good. And then the third, maybe we know least about it, but it is certainly the biggest change that I've seen in the literature, and one that would make us sit up in discussing 1 and 2 differently today than it would have been 10 years ago. So on climate, what is our take on this? How does it qualify everything else? Is it something separate, or is it really part of the agenda? So when Typhoon Haiyan hits the Philippines, when Thailand faced the 2011 floods with the greatest destruction of GDP that we have seen, and the Pakistan floods repeatedly in the last 5 years devastated lands, and then once in a 100-year typhoons hit twice in 2 years in the south of the Philippines, and then the list is just so long that you almost, your eyes glaze because every day there is so many that are reported in a big way. The number one thing would have to be reconstruction and rehabilitation, right? I mean, relief, rehabilitation, and reconstruction has to be the number one priority without a question. And that effort is clearly different between floods and storms, which I said are rising, and earthquakes and volcanoes, which have not been rising, but nevertheless kill a lot of people, especially in urban areas. So that is one part. The attention, unfortunately, focuses heavily on that at the expense of the second part, which is what to do about the next one, especially if it hits the same areas again and again. So to rebuild differently, locating people out of harm's way, and having agriculture more resilient to a repeated phenomenon of the same type would be the commonsensical recommendation. Now, if you are in the Pacific Islands, this is a matter of life and death. I mean, it's not an academic discussion. It's literally in front of our own eyes that this change is happening. Now, so again, before we get to the huge questions of a lot to do about long-term climate, beyond relief and rehabilitation, there is also a very agriculture-related response that would need to be different. Drawing on Typhoon Haiyan, how do you react more quickly with food and food response when you have islands, whether it's the Philippines, Indonesia, or the Pacific. This is a reality. And so moving food more quickly between islands and preparing for that ahead of time would be part of the education and part of the planning of the country. Second, food reserves. Sometimes it's a bad word. It's because it's holding food for eventualities at a high cost whose benefits may never occur, and there will be losses and so on. But that calculus, just like a calculus on a metro done 20 years ago, would be very different when the city is crowded. Same way, that calculus would be changing. So it's time to look at food reserves differently today. And then third, we can have all the logistical preparation and so on, but if the preparation itself is not climate proof, it's not going to be very helpful. So if hospitals, schools, evacuation centers, critical agricultural infrastructure are not themselves climate proof, you're losing the lifelines in the process, and it would have no effect. So then, of course, in all this, the coordination between local and the central governments, central parts of the government differing in different countries would also be critical. So those are what I would call, beyond the immediate relief and rehabilitation, things to prepare for in terms of food and agriculture for the absolute certain recurrence of these things in the next 50 years. You don't know exactly where and when, but they definitely are going to occur. Then comes the third, probably the more debatable part, and I will close with that. Are we okay? I'll close with that. I'll close with that because they are a bit more speculative, and that is, what about climate adaptation and climate mitigation? How much to do? They cost. And that's why people debate it, right? If they didn't cost, then it's a no-brainer. You do them too. What's the problem? We insure our houses. We do this even for 5% probability of a fire or floods. So this would be a no-brainer. But how much to do does depend on the cost. There is the adaptation side, and there's a whole discussion we can have. And then there's the mitigation side. So adaptation, some of the things we mentioned on making the basic infrastructure disaster resistant or resilient is part of adaptation, relocation people, etc. too. But is that enough? And do we just do that? The IPCC figures, they draw a graph which is worth looking at. It's a triangle with adaptation on one side and mitigation on the other. So adaptation is moving people and adapting the infrastructure, etc. Mitigation is to get to the source of the problem one way or the other. A Pacific Island country cannot do that, but the region together can, or the world together can, which is reducing the emissions in the air. So scientists say that 450 parts per million in the air is an absolute break point for an ice-free planet. So we are at slightly over 400 for a minute, for a time, and that's where it's been. So in 20, 25 years, it would get to that. So if the emissions in the air are not addressed, is adaptation enough? So should we put all the effort on adaptation? Should we put all the efforts on mitigation? Or should we do a combination? Without getting into the question today, right this minute, on exactly who does what, I would close by saying that adaptation is critical for food and agriculture and for all the concerns of today that we'll be discussing, without which it will be very difficult. But if it is not coupled or matched with mitigation, it'll never catch up. It's like the water is running and we are very busy mopping the floor. We can keep mopping, but unless somebody turns off the tap, it'll be very difficult to keep up with the flood on the floor. So you need a combination. But this forum cannot solve it today, but we need a combination. That consciousness is extremely essential. So with that, let me just close by saying that this is a very successful region, huge differences between countries and sub-regions, an agriculture concern despite the huge success going forward, productivity increase critical. Examples to draw from within the region, straight productivity increase may not be enough because of the nature of inequality. Inclusive improvements in agricultural productivity actually would be good for productivity itself, in addition to being good for the distributional side. But unless that's coupled with special efforts on hunger and malnutrition, we won't get the benefits that we would like. And this highly doable, maybe the most doable part of the equation. And then finally, the world has changed from the first slide to the last. If climate adaptation plus mitigation are not factored in at some cost, then all the efforts elsewhere will be drowned and overwhelmed. I come from the evaluation side. We can do all the fine-tuning on evaluation and improve productivity by 0.1, 0.00%, etc. But if the big elephant in the room will take the project off the table, then you are looking at the huge effect that needs to be avoided. It probably can be addressed just about, but if you don't include that in the equation, then we lose the big picture as well. And with that, I wish you the very best. Have a wonderful seminar and a wonderful stay in Bangkok. Thank you.